The hardest instrument to get right in any mix is always the dreadful snare. I'd buy every plugin and drum sample I see the pros use, and for years I still struggled to understand why my snares continued to sound terrible. After all this time and making zero progress, I felt defeated and was ready to walk away from mixing. But before giving up, I gave it one more shot. I studied every mix video I got my hands on even closer, and started to notice some of the tricks pros were doing. Once I started applying these tricks in my own mixes, overnight my mixes were sounding better and I gained the confidence to continue pushing forward. And by the end of this video, not only will you know what these tricks are, but you'll also know about the one thing I was doing that was secretly ruining my mixes that you're probably doing too. This first trick is a great one and technically a few tricks in one. Each step helps get the punch and a snare we all desire while also allowing for depth and space. I picked this technique up from the mixer behind bands like System of a Down and Linkin Park. It's a great technique for a modern, aggressive, punchy snare sound. It's the art of not over-compressing so that the snare transient is allowed to poke out a little bit. I'm talking like 3 dB of compression with the 4:1 ratio. Once we've got our snare where we want it, the next thing we'll need to do is use a snare sample to trigger the snare reverb. But the sample has a little more length, which is key, and you'll want to use the real snare to trigger the gate on the snare sample. If the snare sample is too short, then you'll be artificially extending the reverb decay, which can make the drum sound less realistic and works against letting the natural punchiness of the snare cut through. Use the gate to manipulate the length of the sample with the reverb. This trick from Andy Wallace just demonstrates why he's able to achieve such beautiful in-your-face snare sounds in some of the most beloved rock records of all time. But before you run off and steal this powerful trick, it's important to really get a handle on another technique that I found incredibly intimidating when I started recording music. Luckily over time, my ears got better and I became more comfortable with this technique. But I soon discovered, like Alice in Wonderland, the rabbit hole goes much, much further. When I saw one of my favorite mixers take this technique to another level I hadn't seen anywhere else before, my mind was blown. We're all taught to always check the phase and to flip it to make sure the drums are working together nicely. But this trick takes all of that to another level. The snare is the center of our mixing universe, and when I saw Tom Lord-Alge not just flip the phase, but move the rest of the drum mics to phase and time align with the snare drum, it was like walking into the world of mixing Narnia. This gives the snare the spotlight and the punch it needs to cut in any mix because all the drum tracks are supporting the snare. And if doing this by hand in your DAW is too scary, there are plugins like AutoLine and Evo In to make this a bit easier. Phase is so incredibly important, but it's just so damn scary. But once it clicked, there was something else I realized that I was doing incorrectly out of habit. It was the culprit behind so many terrible mixes I had done, and one that you're probably doing too. I remember when I first started reading mixing books, magazine articles, and watching mixing tutorials, I was taught to constantly do this. I mean, this technique is incredibly helpful and should be used whenever possible to create headroom and space in a mix, but with certain instruments like drums, this technique can really ruin everything if the mixer isn't 100% aware of the dangers when using it. It's like a mogwai like Gizmo. Seems sweet and harmless, but if you don't know the rules, you'll end up with gremlins in your mix. While I was watching a mix overview video, I noticed something CLA said. Now here's the thing, I had watched this video multiple times in the past, but it didn't click until phase clicked. He was avoiding this technique as well on drums because he understood that drums were all part of a bigger picture. Using filters can create phase issues when it comes to drum mixing and can really mess up the impact of the drum mix, which is why CLA prefers using shelving EQs on drums instead of filters. Using shelf EQs helps avoid damaging the phase relationships between the drum mics. Remember, the snare is just one part of a much larger group of instruments that make a whole instrument. And filters can really start to screw up the phase of a kit if you're not careful. Phase really helps bring drums together, and the next trick is pretty straightforward now that you've unlocked your new phase plasma superpower like in BioShock. But phase goes even deeper. Remember when I said phase was like a rabbit hole? But I soon discovered, like Alice in Wonderland, the rabbit hole goes much, much further. Well, this next trick is really helpful in creating a natural punchy snare in your drum mix without needing additional samples. You're probably doing something like this but haven't had much success. Next time you duplicate your snare track, duplicate all the plugins in the chain as well, because maintaining phase coherence is gonna make this work. Now if your snare needs more low end punch, use the same plugins in their duplicated track, but alter the EQ frequencies. Need more top end? The same process. This is gonna help you maintain the phase relationship with the duplicates and allow you to use the recorded snare a lot more in the drum mix before reaching for that sample. This is a super easy to do trick Papa Valentine uses often in his mixes to help reduce the need of samples. All these techniques are great at getting the snare to be as punchy as possible, but this next one is a complete game changer. Once I started working with my mentor Bo Burchell, who you may recognize from his band Seosin, and also having worked on records with bands like Era and Senses Fail, there was a trick he was using to get punchy and clean snares in his mixes that utilized a lot of tricks in this video, but in a way I've never seen anyone else do. The technique is pretty simple. You duplicate your snare track and whatever processing you have, move down one insert so the first insert allows for a compressor. You'll need the highest ratio, fastest attack and release settings, and the threshold so the top end of the snare is being compressed. We're gonna use the compressor as a limiter, but this trick won't work with limiters. At the end of the duplicated track signal chain, you'll need just a regular stock EQ and start with the high pass filter around 700 Hz and then flip the phase. With this trick, you're essentially phase canceling out the top end with the EQ, and the compressor is quickly ducking each time the snare gets hit. This creates the most organic, natural sounding gate I've ever used or heard. I promise you, once you try Bo's snare gate trick, it'll be really hard not to use it in every mix. But all these tricks are useless unless your mixes are emotionally captivating the artist and their fans become addicted to listening to the songs you've mixed. Which is why you'll want to watch this video right here for some sneaky tricks the pros use to hook listeners.